I don't really have anything more to say. Oh, come on, you know me better than that. If these walls could talk, if these 130-year-old walls, these ones that are built of stones and mortar, block upon block, marble, granite, all to the glory of God, built 130 years ago, now showing us few signs of what it looks like to be 130 years old. If these walls could talk, do you remember maybe 10, 12 years ago, the Cooper Hewitt across the park from us was undergoing a renovation? They had a great copywriter for their scaffolding signage, and I always enjoyed it going downtown on the Fifth Avenue bus. Their signage covering the scaffolding said, if you were 100 years old, you'd need a little work done too. Same story, different building right here. These walls are wet. The paint is peeling. The plan is to fix them up this week as part of our Easter preparations, but the walls are not yet watertight, so they'll peel again. And these repairs are both cosmetic. There are structural ones needed too, all necessary for maintaining this building, which was built to the glory of God some 130 years ago. If these stones could talk. In recent weeks, I know many of you have seen articles about two other churches in our neighborhood where those stones are talking too. They're actually crying out. Our Methodist neighbors just up West End Avenue at St. Paul and St. Andrew, they're talking about selling their air rights, a more complicated matter than it was for us to sell ours. But as capitalism has figured out how to monetize literally the air that we breathe, I've taken absurdity as a norm and won't put anything past anyone. The Methodist building is crumbling. And it's a real shame. It's a really pretty building. But the sanctuary is far too big for the congregation that now lives there. And they can't support the building. And though they support a lot of ministry in that building, SBSA houses the West Side Campaign Against Hunger, and they do a thriving ministry for food and food justice out of that old building. The second church is West Park Presbyterian over on Amsterdam Avenue, which many of you probably know better as that old church that has had scaffolding like forever right next to Barney Greengrass. Their congregation is now down to only 12. They don't have a minister. And this past week, the Presbytery of New York City voted to move forward with a plan to challenge that church's landmark designation in order to be able to sell that building to a developer. Funny story, it's the same developer that we sold our air rights to and a whole bunch of other treasures a few years back that's building the building north of us on 78th Street that's causing the paint to peel and the walls to be wet. But that's a story best not for church and over whiskey. The Presbytery plans to let that developer raise that building and to build a new tower, a residential tower, with a space for a church on the ground floors, and to give that congregation something like $8.5 million to outfit that space as the church they need it to be. 12 members, $8.5 million, that's quite a church. I'd love to know what those stones are saying up the street. Maybe they've called down to St. Peter's on Lexington Avenue, that church that many of you may know is in the base of the Citigroup building, a building that was built on the ground on which the old St. Peter's Church stood before it was demolished to build the new cathedral, bank, over a church on the ground. Remember when church spires were the tallest things in towns, when they could be seen from all over town, and that they pointed to heaven and they proclaimed God's glory, not ours? No? Neither do I. Seems we've lost our way more than 100 or so years ago at this point. On Monday night, as many of you know, the consistory of the Collegiate Church took its own action about our buildings. The consistory voted to approve the request of our congregation downtown, the one we call Middle Church, to rebuild their church on our historic site on 2nd Avenue. The stones of Middle's facade are the only things that still stand after a fire 16 months ago destroyed that entire building. Those stones, and many people at Collegiate, and indeed across the city, and perhaps most notably in the East Village and Lower East Side, have spent countless nights weeping, days of planning, evenings of long and somewhat contentious meetings and conversations and debates. And now, following our consistory's action on Monday evening, if the way be clear, they will rise again, stone on top of stone. A church is not a building. It is a gathering of disciples and those who want to be more like disciples, to do the work of proclaiming release to the captives and celebrating the sacraments Christ has given us, and of caring for those with the least among us. A church is a people who gather in a building that is also called a church. This causes confusion. So often, the ministry of the church people gets taken over by the needs of the church building. And before we know it, we can spend months, years even, if we're collegiate, debating the needs of our buildings, of what to fix, what can't be fixed, what to keep, what to let go of, what to build, how to restore, what to let go of, how to put the bricks back on the building when they start falling off, how to make them more accessible, how to heat them and cool them, how to get more people into them, particularly those nebulous people, young families that we all want more of. Our buildings. Yes, stewarding them is part of our ministry, and this is very important. But the church building should exist to support the church people, not the other way around. Let me say that again. A church people do not exist to support a church building. A church people exist for ministry. And when a church people start spending too much time talking about their church building, it's time to take stock of what ministry really is. In the old days, which is to say Jesus' day, the church only meant one thing, and it made for a lot less confusion. As the movement of Christ followers grew in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the people of the church gathered in each other's houses, in their apartments, in public spaces where it was safe, and really anywhere they could find. And there, the church people studied, and they celebrated the sacraments. They created rituals and liturgy. They got to know each other. They prayed, and they labored together for the needs of the people in their community. They had zero need for a building, zero need for a church building. They were very busy being the church people. Now, however, if you were to ask anyone on the street, or perhaps let's go straight to the mouths of truth, let's ask a child. Go ahead, find one today, ask one. Ask someone today, what is church? I'm not a betting man, but my wager would be that you'll get an answer that involves a building, probably a Western one, probably with a peaked roof and a tall spire. If you're lucky, that definition might include something, a clause maybe, about the building being a place where people of faith gather. But that's more than I'd wager on. I'll bet only the wise, only the very wise, or the very faithful, which are not mutually exclusive, when asked what a church is, would begin with a discussion of people, to say nothing about a discussion of God. This building, this one, where some of us are gathered today and where many more of us are gathered not today, but online with us. This is where we are churching today. This building is beautiful, and it holds memories for each of us. It's our home. It's where you went on your second date. It's where your sons graduated from high school. It's where you were married. It's where your daughters were baptized. It's where your kids came on Friday night, giving you 2 blessed hours all to yourselves to stare at your spouse in sheer exhaustion. It's where we cook meals for those who have no other food. It's where we hear glorious music. It's where we hear God's word proclaimed. These pews have held you at your most joyous, and they've held you up at your most broken. You've taken vows here, marriage ones, baptismal ones, membership ones, ordination ones, elders and deacons. These stones all around us, these stones will tell the stories of Christmas trees and little rings of paper stapled together to make garlands. They'll tell the story of Easter lilies, of palms, of pageants. These stones would tell the story of our own fire and the vote that Collegiate took to rebuild us not so very long ago. These stones would tell the story of a school that has left. A school that has always been central to our identity. And perhaps these stones would tell of the loss of the noise of school children running up and down those stairs, wearing memories and footprints on those marble steps. If you want to see what the stones of this building know, go look at the steps in the Collegiate School building just down the hall. These stones would tell the story of 6 senior ministers foolish enough to think we could make anything better, and of the countless associates and elders and deacons and members who proved you could. On this day that we begin calling it Palm Sunday, Jesus rides into the great city of Jerusalem, leading a protest march against a hostile regime. The crowds were jubilant and notably not inside any building. And when some of the religious leaders of his time, the ones concerned chiefly with the temple building rather than the temple human body, told Jesus to get his folks in order, his reply was simple. I tell you, my friends, if my friends were silent, even the stones would cry out. Standing as a witness, as they always do, stones will cry out. This day that begins with palms and shouts of hosannas, with imaginations of the Lord as the chief cornerstone that had the stones themselves crying out, this day that ends with a story of a stony place of the skull, there is much, perhaps too much, for any of us to say. Thank God for the stones. We started just a few minutes ago waving our palms and blessing them. And not long from now, we will hear the story of the Passion read by 3 women, remembering the women who first told it. And after that, we will leave these stones of our sanctuary today in silence, for the stones themselves will hold the lament and keep time from here to Thursday's table, to Friday's cross, to Saturday's loss, and to Sunday's great amen. Thank God for the stones. Thank God they are here for us. My God, the stories they could tell and the lament they know. From palms to passion, the stones are here for us. And they are here to help us in our work of ministry. They're here to help us be church. They are not the church. And even if they weren't here, or if they were here in a different way, or we had to stay out of them for nearly 2 years because of a strange plague that nobody could have imagined, the church will go on. The people will go on. We go on because we have a story to tell. It's one of resurrection's promise. And if we can't tell it, if we stumble, or we can't speak, or we don't have the words, the stones themselves will cry out. But try not to let the stones do all the work. Maybe help the stones. Raise your own voice. Tell your own story. Tell the one of God and of God's great love for you and for all people. It's the story we call the Passion. It begins and ends with love.